Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your moderator of the GlobSec session, Baria Alamuddin.
Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to hopefully not a turmoil session. It's a turmoil in Syria and everywhere else in my part of the world, but I hope we will have a smooth, good session where we can all engage, ask interesting, very, very short questions, and so that I can engage more and more of you. Please let me welcome my panelists this morning. I'm going to start with Ambassador and ex-Foreign Minister, Mr. Yashar Bakish. Ambassador Alexander Vershpau from NATO. And Mr. George Friedman, Chairman of the Future Austin. Last but not least, John Jenkins from the IISS. Sir John. Please be seated. I'm not going to read the very long acclaims that these gentlemen have because I'm sure you probably know them or have read them. But I'll just briefly tell you. Mr. Bakish, Ambassador Bakish, an ex-Foreign Minister of Turkey, is here with us. He has long experience in the area. Of course, we all know the involvement of Turkey in the Syrian crisis. And he is hopefully going to, each of the speakers will give us 3 to 4 minutes, very brief ideas of the crisis in Syria. And then we have Ambassador, Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Alexander Vershpau, who is American, by the way, and also Mr. George Friedman, a very well-known writer, a very well-known analyst, who has very interesting predictions in his books. Who's also going to shed light on other aspects. My very long-time friend, Sir John Jenkins, who has worked in various positions as an ambassador in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Syria and Saudi Arabia, has very interesting views indeed that I've heard over the years. So let's start by inviting Ambassador Bakish, perhaps to start your few comments, please.
Thank you very much. There are so many things to be said about Syria that I don't know where to start from, but to make perhaps provocative start, I will say that when the Syrian crisis broke out, now that we are 5 years later today, we should ask ourselves the question whether it wouldn't have been better if we let Syrian government to deal with the question, forgetting about the protection of the people against their dictators, etc., and ask the question whether the loss of lives and the destruction of the physical infrastructure of the country would have been worse in case the international community was not to get involved.
You're not trying to tell me that he should try and kill more than 400,000 people, Ambassador, and
he wouldn't.
He will do it. So you want more people to die and more than 200 injured.
We should ask.
I hope I got this wrong.
We should ask the question whether he would have killed more people in case international community was not to intervene. So let's start from this provocative question and see how it's going, and also Turkey's downing of the Russian plane, in case Turkey was not to do it, whether we would have allowed Russia to find an excuse to settle down there and to arrive at the place where...
Very interesting. I think before we start that, and I continue with you, Ambassador, I would like to us all to watch a very brief video that GlobSec have actually prepared for us. So let's watch it, please. This is a very, very well-prepared video by GlobSec, and it's a very painful one, especially for somebody like me. I'm Lebanese, and I know wars. I've lived wars. And I just want to tell you today that while we listen to all the analysis, that you go deep into your heart and think of all these very painful images. We all are responsible. We all should be doing something. Ambassador, can I go to you, please?
Okay. Well, thanks very much. And I'll start right out where Ambassador Yakish left off. I think it's pretty clear that it couldn't have been worse had we let the government take its course. But the fact that we didn't do enough, and the situation has just gotten steadily worse. We've finally woken up to it fully here, because what started as a crisis that was a tragedy for the Syrian people when their own leadership waged war against them, spread to the wider region, but now it's spread to Europe and to our streets in terms of terrorism, in terms of the migration crisis. And of course, the growth of ISIL continues apace. We've made a dent, but I don't think we've reversed their momentum yet. NATO isn't the first responder. NATO isn't where the policy is made, but our allies are directly engaged. The US leads the coalition. All the allies are contributing in one way or the other. And so I'm happy to offer some thoughts on how to get out of the hole that we're in. And I think NATO may have a role to play in the longer term, which I'll mention later on. Clearly, the international community, no one in the international community has covered themselves in glory in the last 5 years. We can debate whether earlier intervention would have made a better situation than we have today. But I think the focus now has to be on what do we do now, having seen the situation get worse and worse. I agree with Minister Judah from the previous session that we have to do everything we can to give some chance for diplomacy to succeed. But it has to be a diplomatic settlement based on the UN Resolution 2254 and the 2012 Geneva Accord, which is reaffirmed in that resolution, which means a transition to a leadership acceptable to all the people. The question, of course, is whether a country I know well from my career, Russia, is prepared to really use its leverage to achieve a diplomatic solution. They clearly have succeeded in saving Assad from being toppled. They've cemented their status in the region, and they've forced the international community to accept that Russia is an equal participant in any diplomatic solution. But the question in my mind is that all they really wanted? Do they want to expend the extra leverage to offend their Iranian allies and actually push for a solution in which Assad sooner or later would go? I'm still skeptical, but we have to try. But in the meantime, while diplomacy comes first, we have to continue to ratchet up the pressure on ISIL, because that's ultimately the existential challenge for the world and including for Europe. We've reduced Daesh's area of control in Iraq and Syria significantly, but it's still not been enough to defeat the narrative of Daesh. I think they still are attracting new recruits to the caliphate, and including those who come from European countries to fight and then go back and wreak havoc on our streets. So more decisive action, I think, is needed, and 2016 needs to be really a turning point, the year where Daesh is expelled from its main strongholds, both Mosul, Raqqa, so that we can begin to defeat the narrative and show that they're not the future, that a more peaceful Middle East is the future. Now finally, let me just say a couple words about where NATO might fit in. I think NATO's main role, beyond providing the nations who are in the coalition, but longer term, NATO as an institution has a role to play in promoting the longer term stabilization of the wider region. We have a lot of experience in what we call defense capacity building, and I think if we're ever going to kind of stabilize the countries of the Middle East and North Africa, particularly those that are already at risk or have verging on failed states, they need much more help, and NATO could be part of an international coalition to provide support to building up the capacity of countries across the region to better resist radicalization, better resist terrorism, stabilize local conflicts, so that the soil on which ISIL has been able to grow is changed and a much more long-term and a positive future can be established for the Middle East.
Thank you, Ambassador. I hope in Europe and elsewhere in the world, we look at the crisis in Syria and remember the origins of this crisis. It wasn't defeating Daesh only. We all want to defeat Daesh. Daesh is our enemy all over the world. There is a crisis called the Syrian people that are trying to achieve democracy, transparency, the rule of law, and to live decently like we all do. Thank you. Please, Mr. Friedman.
Well, 100 years ago, Western imperial powers created a map of the Arab world. And now that map is coming apart. One of the illusions is that we have the force not only to be present in this event, but to shape it. We speak about intervention without defining what that intervention means, how long it will take, and what we're trying to achieve. But there is this fantasy about intervention, which by now should have passed, that intervention magically solves problems. Sometimes it does, mostly it creates new ones. We have to understand there's a massive social movement underway. The Arab world, from North Africa to the Middle East, is redefining who it is, most likely in ways that Europeans and Americans won't necessarily approve of. The regional powers, there are four great regional powers, would be Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. They have no common agenda. They have no sufficient force to reshape the region. The traditional solution in the region has been Turkish power for centuries, dominating the region, bringing a sort of order. Turkey is not inclined to do this. So I think we ought to start this conversation first understanding this is not about Syria, but about the Arab world, Syria in particular, one of the cases. And secondly, we ought to begin this very modestly, that policymakers at think tanks in Washington and London are not going to come up with a solution for this. We lack the military force to impose our will. We have enough military force to find ourselves in very difficult positions. And our regional allies are as hostile to each other, and some of them hostile to us. So this is an enormous problem, and here we must face the limits of politics and the limits of military power. It may be tragic, certainly is, that 400,000 Syrians would be killed, but the tragedy doesn't obscure the reality. So when we start thinking about intervening, as an American, we have intervened in Iraq, we have intervened in Libya, we have no appetite for intervening.
Obviously.
So I will pass it on that.
Thank you. Sir John Jenkins.
Thanks, Bara. I mean, the title of this session is Silver Bullet. Silver Bullet actually is magic. And magic, of course, in Islam is haram. But I think there's quite a lot of magical thinking going on at the moment about Syria. I thought it was fascinating listening to Nasser Jude in the last session. Because Jordan is a frontline state. And Jordan has a massive interest in a settlement that restores some sort of stability and security on its borders, not just in Syria, but in Iraq, and indeed also in Lebanon. And we have a process, and of course Nasser was talking about the Geneva process and so forth, which is happening now. And Jordan has a particular role in this because A, is a frontline state, and B, is instrumental in forming the Syrian opposition delegation to Geneva. But if you look in detail at this, at what's happening, there's all sorts. It looks as if it's built on quicksand. This thing. If I'm sitting in Moscow, I'm thinking what we really need is a process that gets us through the next 3 or 4 months, and then, of course, the US presidential campaign kicks in earnest. And basically, the US administration will not be able to engage properly with this until towards the end of the first half of next year. So we've given us, there's a bit of a breathing space for us to do what we like. And I think if you're Assad, you're probably thinking the same thing, only in spades redoubled. Geneva, the accord at Geneva, Geneva 1, of course, was the text of this stipulates that Assad should go, and there should be a replacement, a transitional period and a replacement. I'm not sure that's how Assad looks at this, and I'm not actually sure that's how Putin looks at this either, or Lavrov. Even though the Russians will say, we are not wedded to Assad. Well, maybe they're not, maybe they are, maybe they're not. I think the Iranians probably are, and that they see Assad as the guarantor of their continuing presence in Syria, and a guarantor of their continuing ability to support Hezbollah, which ultimately for Iran is a major issue. In addition, even if you had a restoration of authority under Assad or somebody else, what does that authority look like? I mean, Assad controls 25% of the territory, probably. He controls far more of the people. If you look at where the people are in Syria, he's probably controlling 70% of the people. And I think there is a substantial proportion of the Syrian people, Sunni and Alawite and Druze and so forth, who support Assad because the fear of somebody else, of some jihadi regime coming to power in Damascus, is fantastically frightening for them, Christians as well. But these groups exist. There are the Kurds as well, up in the north, and the Kurds, of course, are sort of semi-detached from the Geneva process, the PYD at any rate. But they're essential to this. They're the people who are doing a lot of the fighting up in the north. They're not the only people doing the fighting. There is also the FSA. I mean, the FSA is doing far more than people think it is, both in the north and the south.
True.
You talk to Israelis, the Israelis will say the FSA, the people like Jabhat Nusra in the north are not like Jabhat Nusra in the south. This is a mosaic of conflict. And even if you have a settlement which is achieved diplomatically through the Geneva process, can it stick?
Sure. Thank you very much. By the way, FSA is the Free Syrian Army, for those of you who don't know exactly. This is really a very interesting prospect that you have all given us. And I'm going to take my privilege as a moderator and kick in with one or two questions, if I may. I had a very interesting briefing lately with a very senior diplomat, a Russian diplomat, who told me that, guess what? Nobody controls anything. Americans don't matter. Sorry about that. The Europeans are even less mattering in this situation. We control the solution. It's going to be on our terms. Hell with the Syrian people, hell with the Arab people. We control everything. Is this true, gentlemen? I would like you all to answer this question.
Half true.
Yes, yes. Second question that I want to also be provocative in. Where is Iran now in Syria? What role does it play? Is it completely sidelines? I agree with John there that what Iran wants is to make sure it has room to send arms to our beautiful Hezbollah. Okay, so where are we there? Thank you very much. And then I want to take questions from the audience, nice, cute little ones. And then I hope there is somebody from the young leaders of GlobSec. I want to take one or two questions from them. Thank you very much. Yes, 1 minute. I'm just going to ask.
So I think we will have to give our answers in less than 3 minutes to these two questions. And
yes, please. Also, I want you to be brief.
For this comment of Russian ambassador, diplomat, I think that the Russians have a strong grip in Syria, and they got this opportunity because of the weakening position of Bashar Assad, and it has become a question of survival. Then he turned to Russia, and Russians waited until that time so that they can come there as a legitimate foreign power which is invited there upon the legitimate authorities in inverted commas of the country. But are they commanding everything in detail? Well, you cannot say. I mean, it will depend upon many other things because there are other actors, Turkey being one of them, but not the most important of them. America is still the most important. So,
but are the Americans engaging, Ambassador? This is the problem.
No,
they
but
say that the Americans
have
and the
other
Russians.
ways.
I see.
If Americans other ways, through NATO, through influencing Turkey, etc. The other question, Iran. Yesterday in another forum, last night, I tried to put myself in the shoes of Iranian decision makers. What you, Beria, would have done if you were
Iranian.
Ali Khamenei in the
Oh,
present
I hope I'm not.
circumstances.
What I would do, I would stop interfering in any capital in the world. I would stop interfering in Syria. They have nothing to do in Syria. Hezbollah should not be created in Lebanon. There is a Lebanese state. There are Lebanese people that live there. And if I were them, I'll be a good Muslim that I should be and live peacefully with all my other Muslim nations.
Amen.
Yes, yeah.
Yes. Thank you for asking me that question. Please.
I'll just answer the question.
Thank you.
I addressed this a bit before. I think the Russians may be a little overly optimistic about controlling the situation, if that's what your interlocutor said. I mean, clearly the Russian intervention achieved at least short and medium-term objectives in terms of preventing the fall of Assad, which was important for them both in terms of their view of the conflict, but also it was an issue of principle for President Putin, preventing internationally engineered regime change. This is something he worries about with respect to his own regime. That's why we saw him go against Ukraine, because another example of regime change which could eventually come home to roost. But it's also about reestablishing Russia's stature and status in the world, and of course securing long-term access to the air and naval bases, which Russia now has in its hands. But controlling the situation beyond that, I'm not sure Russia's prepared to commit so much more military power and its prestige. And that would run the risk, actually, of complicating its geopolitical situation if it seemed to be kind of joining the Shiite bloc. Could only kind of further roil the waters in the Middle East. So I think, as I said before, I think Russia may be basically content with no war, no peace. Sitting at the top table, Lavrov and Kerry spending lots of time together, but not necessarily
Strange bedfellows.
not necessarily wanting to produce a solution. And as was said, maybe just waiting for time to pass, new U.S. administration, because the alternatives, the actual implementation of a political settlement, even if it were reachable, might lead to so many unknowns and uncertainties that better the situation you've got now. Iran, I think, has seen Russia probably help its position by saving Assad, but I don't think Iran is going to defer indefinitely to Russian leadership in Syria. So I think one could see a competition developing there.
Yes.
But right now, their interests seem pretty much aligned.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman.
I think Russia is much less interested in Syria than it is in domestic politics. Its economic situation is near catastrophic. Its performance in Ukraine was awful. Its intelligence forces failed to understand what was happening in Kiev. They failed to trigger an uprising in the east. Their military forces were fought to a kind of standstill into a frozen conflict by the Ukrainians. Putin must reassert his capabilities. The important thing about Syria is not even saving Assad, although he'd want to. It is demonstrating that he is a global player. Yesterday, when a minor event happened, an American destroyer in the Black Sea was buzzed. If you read the Russian media, they are broadcasting that a secret weapon on board these planes was able to cancel out all American weapon systems. 2 points to make. You don't attack an American destroyer by coming in overhead. You do it from 70 miles out at least. So that wasn't what it was. And secondly, the last thing you would probably reveal is that you have the ability to destroy all American systems on a destroyer. That'd be the greatest secret. The point is to look at this as a fabric. His audience is not the United States, it is not Syria. His audience is the Russian public. He's being a very successful leader. And the same is true of Iran. We're in a situation where Iran, like Russia, like the United States, like everyone else, has limited capacity to actually affect the circumstances they want, but they must project to their own people, the United States accepted in this, a competence that they don't really have. And so what we must look at about the Iranians is they cannot make the concession to their right wing or to the general public that they have lost control of the situation with Hezbollah and other matters. The Russians cannot accept that they are a second-rate power, which they are at best. They must demonstrate that they are a player in Syria. And we always think that they have us in mind. In fact, that's not who they're thinking about.
Sure. John?
I think it's fascinating. I take all these points. Putin in many ways is like Bismarck. Bismarck said, when I see an opportunity, I take it. Then I step back and think about how I exploit it. And this is, it seems to me, is what. And he looks as if he's enjoying himself, to be quite honest. Iran, and just one point, the other meeting that's happening this weekend is in Doha, which is the meeting of selected members of OPEC and non-OPEC, including Russia, to talk about stabilizing the oil market. If we look over the last year, the Deputy Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, has paid, I think, 3 visits to Moscow, to Sochi, to talk to Putin about Syria, about oil market issues and so forth. Whatever else has or hasn't happened, Moscow has become the address for people to go to. Yesterday, I think Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Quds Force in the Revolutionary Guards, was in Moscow, again in defiance of a travel ban, talking to the Russians about various things, including, I presume, the supply of S-300s to Iran, but also about Syria. So a lot of Arabs in the Middle East will say, senior Arabs will say, I don't like what Putin does, but I like the way he does it. And that actually has given Russia a shaping capability, at least in the short term, which nobody else has. Iran is interesting. There's one point I want to make about Iran. Because what Iran has done in Syria is what it essentially did in Lebanon, what it did to itself after '79, which is to militiafy a society. Once you militiafy a society, it's hard to go back, especially when that's accompanied by sectarian mobilization. But what's interesting at the moment in Syria is we're also seeing now the Iranians saying that they have elements of the regular army inside Syria, the Artesh.
Yes.
And they're publicizing casualties as well. This, it seems to me, and I owe this insight to somebody else, it's not mine, reflects internal Iranian politics, because whatever happens also in Syria will affect the balance of forces between conservatives, principalists, and whatever you want to call the people around Rouhani and Zarif. There's something about this which comes back on Iran, as what happens in Syria comes back on Saudi Arabia, comes back on Turkey, comes back on the Emirates, comes back on Qatar, and comes back on Jordan.
Sure. I will come back to you, Ambassador. I just want to start with the GlobSec young leaders, and I believe some of them are here. Can you please identify yourself? Please. I see a mature young leader here.
Young at heart.
We're all mature young leaders.
Yes, I'm going to start with you. To be honest, so please go ahead. But I would like to take the...
Respect for my gray hair.
No, you have lovely gray hair, sir, if I may say. But it's a bit mature. Go ahead, please.
So, as far as Russia was mentioned, I want to go to...
We need a microphone.
I want to represent myself. I'm ambassador of Russia, former ambassador in Slovakia, by the way. I'm an Arabist and expert on the Middle East, and a member of Russian Council for International Affairs.
We are the right man.
Yes.
The right man.
Right. So I didn't want to interfere, to intervene. Intervene is now out of fashion, as I felt from the discourse of my colleagues.
Sure.
Yes, but what diplomat? It is not a diplomat you were talking about, talking with. It was, I think, a political manipulator, because we have
Well, I
now
didn't fall
a
for
lot
it,
of
so...
a lot of people who consider themselves an expert on the Middle East, but actually they are political technologists.
So you don't agree with the
I don't
politician?
agree with this estimation at all, absolutely. No one in Russia thinks that Russia is, that everything is out of control.
Can I
in
ask you
Syria.
to hold the microphone?
Everything is out of control in Syria.
Could
No
you be
one.
brief,
It is superficial to think that Russia is so naive. You know, first, that nobody at the present world order, and especially in the region order in the Middle East, can control anything. Neither the United States nor Russia, without speaking about Europe, who disappeared as a political actor in the Middle East. And in this situation, only the United States and Russia felt that they must to do something.
Yes.
And
Can I
they did.
have your
They are
comment
doing
outside, and then if you have a question,
They
please,
are doing
because-
something. So I don't have question. I have only a small comment I did. Yes, on the complexity of the situation.
I
Don't
hope I
think
haven't
Russia is
started
so
a
naive.
diplomatic row,
Yes.
Ambassador, but can we give the, have you finished? Sorry,
thank you.
sorry about that.
Thank you.
I'll happily talk to you outside, actually. Thank you, Ambassador, thank you. Dr.
Thank you,
Ibtisam.
Barbara.
Wissam, please.
I'm Sam Kitbi from UAE. I have two questions, very brief. If the nuclear deal tied with conditionality on Iranian intervention in the regional fight, mainly Syria, could we solve the problem of Syria better than what we have it now? The other question, for all of you, whom do you think from those players in Syria, Iran, Russia, United States, and others, can be excluded, and the Syrian fight can be resolved very well if the American outside of this, or can you exclude
Thank you, Dr.
Iranian now
Ibtisam.
from the Syrian fight?
Thank you. I still want somebody from the young leaders, please. Oh, over there, excuse me. Over there. Yes, would you like, yeah, thank you. Can I just have the answer, and then I'll come back to you. Thank you very much. Please, Ambassador. You
I will
also
answer.
had a comment before, just to remind you.
This was a slight disagreement with the comments on the potential intentions of Russia, whether it was to save Syrian regime or not. My take is that Russia has the strategic goal of Russia is to settle down, to return to the Middle East. And the Syrian crisis is one step of it. In the long run, if I were in Putin's
But they always
shoes-
had bases in Syria. I mean, there's...
It has, but now it is more deep-rooted. In addition to the Tartus naval bases, Russia has established Khmeimim
Sure.
air base south of Latakia, and it will do more according to how the situation would evolve. So Russians' strategic approach has to be, in my opinion, it is up to the Russian decision makers, to settle down in the Middle East, to penetrate there more deeply. And Syria is an excellent stepping stone because they were present there.
Sure.
Now,
Could
to
answer
the
briefly the
second
questions.
question regarding who could be excluded from the Dr. Ibtisam's question. I think every country which are actor there have their role to play, now that it has become so complicated. But if there were lesser countries to be involved, this question would have been less complex. The complexity has increased with the additional involvement of the foreign actors and the diversity of their agenda. Every single country has a different agenda which is not identical with another. This makes the situation more complex.
Sure. Please, Ambassador.
Well, Dr. Ibtisam's first question, I think it would have been nice if the Iran nuclear deal had constraints on Iran's regional behavior, and if it had constraints on their ballistic missile programs, but adding all those things would mean that there wouldn't be any Iran nuclear deal at all. I think we have to recognize that it solved, at least for the next 10 or 15 years, one specific and very urgent problem, rolling back the breakout time of Iran to produce a nuclear weapon. But we need other strategies to contain Iran's regional mischief-making, including in Syria. And on the second question, sort of an artificial question, whether you could literally exclude any of the major powers. But I think you do need to have the United States and Russia as part of this. They're Security Council members. One can't exclude the other. But I think also, I think only the United States has the the different forms of leverage, if it uses it with Russia, to persuade them to do what I think they're not prepared to do right now, which is to push for a real transition beyond Assad. I think right now there's not enough incentive or pressure on Russia to do that.
Yes.
The U.S. could perhaps bring that about.
Absolutely, that's very good point. Mr. Friedman.
I don't know the end game. I mean, we have levers, but what is the stable end? So the Russians, again, let's go back to Russian history. When they were contained by the United States in 1948 with Turkey, they flanked us later on in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, and so on, Egypt. And this is a reasonable thing for the Russians to do. But then they were dealing with relatively stable nation states. Now it's quicksand.
Sure.
So the issue here again is, this is not an engineering problem. We don't have to sit down, work together, and create an architecture. This is a massive social upheaval. And when we intervene in it, we sort of get caught up in it, and it carries us away. We have to be very cautious about intervention. Intervention has to have an end that's achievable, a force structure that's capable of achieving it, and a political consensus in the own country that it needs to be done. Could the United States do all these things? I don't even know that it would be possible if we would want to.
Yeah.
Can the Russians do it? No. They can save the regime, but the country is the regime won't fall, but the country won't become stable. So we all have the same problem, and we sit here as if somebody hasn't thought of a mathematical formula to solve this problem. And
Yes.
there is no mathematical formula.
The problem is many people in the world believe that if there was intervention at the very beginning of the crisis, we wouldn't have had Daesh expand so much, we wouldn't have had all these problems.
That's an interesting theory.
John? Yes, I've heard it many times.
But thanks. I mean, I actually think there were things we could have done at the beginning when this happened in 2011 in Daraa and later. But we are where we are. I think the nuclear deal, there was the regional states actually didn't want a direct connection between the nuclear deal and Iran's other behavior in the region, because the fear was that Iran would use the deal as a lever to extract concessions on its position in the region. And the fear was that it would attain recognition as the natural hegemon in the region. I think it was clear that people wanted a separate set of discussions or a separate mechanism for constraining Iran's non-nuclear activities in the region. And the nuclear deal is done. I mean, it's a nuclear deal, fine, it's good, we move on. The other stuff about what Iran does in Yemen or in Syria or in Iraq or in Lebanon or as it was in Sudan and so forth are serious issues. And this speaks to the complexity of this whole issue, which makes it very difficult to resolve, which I think we're all talking about. Historically, the convener of any sort of security dispensation in the region was the United States. Now, I think we've all read the Atlantic interview with Jeff Goldberg. We know what President Obama thinks about this. It's highly unlikely, in fact, it's not going to happen that the Americans are going to step into this. I personally think this is not just about President Obama. This is something structural in the U.S., in U.S. politics, which means that even if it's a Clinton administration next or a Trump administration, I think it's highly unlikely that the US will step in to do what it used to do in this region. But the only way you get agreements, not just in this region, but in the Balkans, think about what happened at Dayton, when Richard Holbrooke basically locked everybody in a hangar and wouldn't let them out until they did the deal, was if you have somebody who actually forces this from the top. I just don't see that at the moment. So I think we're in for conflict, turbulence for a very long time.
I hate to agree with you, John, on this. The young leaders, yes, please.
First, gentlemen, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. My name is Ivan Lidarev, and I'm advisor at Bulgaria's parliament. So I have two questions for you. The first question is, if there is a deal on Syria, inevitably the Russians and the Iranians would probably extract a price of sorts. So do we have any indicator what concessions they want in exchange? That's my first question. And the second is, I believe that there are substantial differences, fundamental differences between the Iranians and the Russians on Syria. What could the West, and especially the US, do to increase the cleavage between the two sides and essentially improve our negotiating position? Thank you.
Well, I hope it's going to be a very, 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 very small price that they want to have. Can we ask you for your very short comments, please?
Yes, in my opinion, it will be a regime in Syria which will be helpful to Russia and Iran, which means it will be a Shia-dominated country, if not what the international press refers to useful Syria. That's to
And
say,
Turkey can live with that, a Shia-dominated country right
No.
next to it.
no, Turkey
Perhaps.
is in favor of
So in
keeping
fighting, more fighting,
Uh,
it low-key
No,
fight.
the question was what is the price
Sure,
or concession?
sure.
So I think this is what they would like to have.
Sure, sure. Thank you. Ambassador?
I'm not sure I know enough about the ins and outs of these negotiations, but I would agree with that point that Russia ultimately wants kind of to have its long-term strategic position kind of secured or guaranteed, if you can speak of guarantees in that unstable part of the world. Keeping the bases, having at least a prominent and influential role with the new government. So it probably does mean a government as you just described it.
Yes.
I'll defer to my colleagues on how we could exploit divisions between
Any thoughts,
Russia and
George?
Iran.
I think of Lebanon in 1970, 1980. The government collapsed, and there were various groups. We were told that Walid Jumblat was a left-winger and Gamaliel was a right-winger.
He's not.
I have never understood that distinction. We didn't understand Lebanon, was the point. Many countries tried to intervene. Israel, the United States, the Russians had a substantial covert presence. Everybody was there. It was like the bar scene in Star Wars. No one could control the situation. So there was this illusion that we could all get together and have a settlement over the Lebanese heads over what Lebanon was going to look like. No. Now, Walid Jumblat is still there, Nabi Berri is still there, all of them are still there. They knew how to survive, and they crafted together a solution. We could not craft one over their heads, and Ronald Reagan quite properly withdrew after the events. So we should look at Lebanon as the first case of the Sykes-Picot countries collapsing, and take a look at the model that was there, and stop imagining that even the United States Marines, half the Israeli army, and God knows what else, can settle this situation. It is, you've said that there is a structural shift in the United States. Yes, after Afghanistan, after Iraq, and after Libya, it has finally dawned to us that we can't achieve the missions that we want to achieve. And this is, I think, a very wise move. I welcome the Russians' attempt.
So, John, another Lebanon and Syria?
First of all, I should say, as a former British diplomat, I don't think these are Sykes-Picot borders. They're borders that emerged at Lausanne and Sèvres, which, of course, is what the Kurds always used to blame us for selling them out at Sèvres. And a lot of that, of course, was about Turkey. It was Turkey, essentially. Negotiations with Turkey would set the borders in Syria, and particularly Iraq, the northern borders. I think the difference between Lebanon then and the situation now is what happened. Lebanon was the last place in the Middle East where what happened in one country stayed in one country. It was a civil war, everybody fought in Lebanon. Now we're seeing this stuff transnational. Everything is across borders. And I think in the end, even if you have this sort of settlement, and I agree, this is the settlement that if there is a deal to emerge, this deal will emerge. It'll be a top-down imposed deal. There'll be an awful lot of people who won't accept it within the country. And you have the problem of Daesh, of the Islamic State. You have the problem of Hezbollah and how Hezbollah recovers itself after what it's done in Syria, in the region more widely. Which actually, for me, also means that Israel should be worried about this in the longer term. So you can have a deal. I just don't think it'll be stable.
Sure. Yes, please, Jonathan from Rusi.
Jonathan Isle from Rusi in London. Question to our Turkish colleague. I hear very often, I was in Turkey last week, I hear very often sort of complaints about what others are doing. Can I just ask what Turkey got wrong in its own handling of Syria? I mean, I know I hesitate to ask whether Mr. Erdogan was wrong because he tends
The lady
to sue.
in the white.
But where do you think you got it wrong yourselves, as opposed to what the Brits, the Americans, the Russians, and everyone else got wrong? I mean, I happen to believe that you have not been any more successful than we were in handling the crisis next door. And the question to Sir John, is it what is the particularly European policy likely to be within this coalition in Syria? Are we just sort of dragged along because we can't...
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. Can I ask you to stick to one question? I see lots of hands up. Thank you. No worries. You're welcome. Please.
Well, what Turkey got wrong? Actually, Turkey started by doing the right thing at the beginning. And I will contradict what I said at the very beginning for the not involvement of other countries, etc. And Turkey intervened thinking that a dictator, I mean, the responsibility for protection, that's to say, a dictator is using disproportionate force against its people. And at that time, Turkey thought that Bashar Assad's fall was imminent and bet all his things on this. That's to say, Turkey did something which shouldn't have never been done in diplomacy. Turkey put all its eggs in the basket that presumes that Bashar Assad's fall was imminent. And if it was going to fall immediately, then Turkey would have reaped the advantage, but it turned the other way. And then the international community, United States especially, and Turkey's way parted. The international community put on brake when it noticed that the weapons or assistance provided to the opposition was ending up in the wrong hands. Turkey was not quick enough to do it, and Turkey was left, if we want to use a football terminology, Turkey was left on the offside position in this game, and it could not correct this at the later stages.
Sure.
This is one thing. Secondly, Turkey as a secular country could have made more effort to desectarianize the conflict. This is a job that could suit it very well, Turkey as a secular country.
Yes.
And Turkey could have played this role.
It's a question
and
of leadership.
It failed to
Yes.
do this role,
Yes.
to play this role.
Yes, I think, John, you have a...
I think Europe is under massive pressure domestically, internally. I think that it has, the refugee migrant crisis has imposed massive strains. And what I see of Europe's policy in its near abroad, in the south, is essentially a belated attempt to reconstruct an external border, which it should have done when it introduced Schengen. I don't see a coherent policy towards it. I mean, and then we cross our fingers and I hope that the UN process is going to work. We basically put all our faith in the UN, which is, I ask the question, is that a load-bearing structure at the moment? I don't think so. I personally think that in the end, in the longer term, the answer to this has to be, for individual countries, Britain, France, Germany, and so forth, to rebuild genuine operational relationships with the key Sunni states. And that includes Egypt, that includes Saudi Arabia, that includes the Emirates. And that's problematic, clearly, because of the reputation a lot of these countries have in the West. But in the end, it is about realpolitik.
Okay, the young lady, the pretty lady in the white.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Nergis Abi, and I am a Kurd.
Can you stand, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
It's with regards to the Geneva talks and the future stability of the new Syria that will be created. And I'm pretty sure I know what Sir Jenkins will say to this question, so my question will be referred to the three gentlemen here. Do you think it's wise to not allow the Kurds to participate in these talks?
Yes, can I ask you to be as brief as possible, please, because we really have lots of people.
Can I answer by one word?
Oh, yes, lovely.
No, it is not wise to not to let
yes
Kurds
no?
to participate in.
Again, I'm not speaking for the United States or anyone else, but clearly at some point the Kurdish people of Syria need to be part of the solution and part of whatever new structure, federal, confederal, is worked out. But whether that's the meeting's taking place now or at some later stage,
Sure.
I don't know.
John?
I think the Kurdish situation is critical and has to be addressed. Whether this is to be done at a meeting or not, I don't know. They like to have meetings. It makes them feel good. But nothing will come out of this.
Good picture opportunity, all these meetings, aren't they? Okay, the gentleman over here.
Alexander Nikitin, Moscow. Moscow could be flexible about names. In cases of Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, and Gaddafi, the West considered Moscow to be partner of these regimes, but finally Moscow appeared to be a partner of the West in dealing with these regimes. So in any future elections in Syria, solutions could be quite experimental. So my question is, out of three options, which one you prefer? The full control of Damascus regime over Syria, federalization of Syria is option two, onto several regions under very, very autonomous rule, or a split of Syria and emergence of Kurdistan, Daeshstan, and Damascustan.
I want somebody from the young leaders to raise their hand, please, if there is anybody here from the young leaders. Yes, okay, can we please give him the microphone? Please, gentlemen. Answer the...
We should go from right to left once in a while.
Shall I?
Oh, yes, John. John is always ready.
Yeah.
I was looking at the
John,
Twitter
do
feed.
you want to answer the question from the Russian gentleman? No, no,
I have
that was just asked.
Sorry, I was
Oh, okay, not to
No,
worry.
I
Not to worry. Let's skip. Let's skip. Let's go.
Actually,
Yes,
George,
no.
do you have do you have an answer?
Well, you know, my answer is that none of us have the power to have only three solutions. I have no idea what the solution is, and I'm getting tired of
Sure.
repeating this.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Ambassador, do you have a?
Well, I think it's impossible probably to see a long-term solution based on option one, on a true, a centralized state. I think there's been too much destruction and violence and killing. So if there's any solution at all, it's probably something along the lines of federalization, if it's achievable at this stage. But that even that may be too late.
Yes, please.
Actually, the question was, which one of these three options is I
Yes.
prefer?
Yes.
I think it is going to happen in this order, in the order that he said. First, one Syria to be controlled by the present regime will be tested. Everything will have to be done, or will be done, in order to secure it. If not, federalization is the second option. If this does not work, disintegration will be unavoidable.
Sure, John.
I'm ready
briefly.
now. I'm ready now. I think first of all, 2 points. One is for any solution, whatever it is, to work, you have to deal with Daesh. Daesh has to go. I mean, of course, ideationally they will remain unless you do something about Sunni grievances in the wider Middle East, particularly in Iraq. So whatever the solution is, Daesh need to go. And the second bit of this is you need to stabilize the Sunni communities in Iraq. So nothing's going to happen until
Sure.
after Mosul is retaken.
Okay. Another GlobSec leader, young leader, please.
You know I was
Right.
gonna say this.
Thank you all. My question is, so at this point in the conflict with Russian intervention,
Sorry, you didn't say who you were.
oh, Brian Kirk, I'm from the United States. At this point in the conflict with Russian intervention and assistance from Iran and Hezbollah, Assad has significant momentum and the upper hand in diplomatic negotiations. So my question is, what is the likelihood, if Assad stays in power, that he will include members of the opposition in the new government? And who are the members of the opposition that could actually serve in such a capacity?
Please, anybody can I ask two actually from the panelists? Anybody would like to answer this so that we don't all? Yes, please.
I think it's a mistake to regard Damascus as the government of Syria, any more than it was proper to think of the Beirut government as the government of Lebanon.
True.
It is simply another warlord, another faction, and the idea that somehow, and it's not just legitimacy, that in practical sense the city of Damascus is now the capital of Syria is no longer true. What the Russians have done is made certain that Assad's presence in the capital, in this city, remains. But the real issue is that there are so many factions, they are so diverse, they are so hard to define, that how you build a coalition out of them that can govern is beyond me. There are just so many. And then there's Daesh, and I'm agreeing that definitely we should do something about it. And as soon as somebody tells me what to do, we should do it.
Great. Can I ask? Would you like to answer?
If you ask me.
Yes,
if you
sure.
want to
I'll ask you
whether-
briefly, please, to answer.
Actually, who should rule Syria in the future after the crisis? the Security Council decision, resolution 2254, says that after the transition, the decision has to be left to the Syrian people. Of course, Syria is so fragmented that a sensible and reasonable outcome may not be produced by the elections, but we may come as close to democracy as possible. There is no country in the world which is a rose garden without thorn. Every country, even the most democratic country, have their problem. And the post-crisis Syria will be again a country with many problems. But since the Security Council decision spells out it is the outcome of the international community, this is how we should look at it. It says that after this transition period, it should be up to the Syrian people to decide what to do with their
This is the ideal, isn't it? But I also wish
ideal.
the UN has some leverage to do anything in the world.
It is platonic, but
yes,
all other alternatives are worse than this.
I agree.
So it has to be left to the Syrian
Yes, indeed.
people.
I'll take the gentleman here and then the gentleman here.
Frank O'Donnell, Ireland. I think we all wish Staffan de Mistura on the UN side every success with the negotiations in Geneva, but recognize that these are it's only a partial step. But hopefully it will be a contribution that can be built on by others. My father's replacement as an Irish Army officer serving in Unso in 1967 was shot dead in the Golan Heights. And I think we have forgotten that one of the first countries to intervene in Syria, and which continues to occupy a part of it in the Golan, is Israel.
Sure.
Now, Israel has wisely stayed out of this conflict in all other respects. But I'm wondering what the panelists would think Israel can do within the territories it controls and Israel proper, other than just appointing an Arab in Galilee as Deputy Commissioner of Police. Is there not more that Israel can do to reach out to the Arab population and the Palestinians in particular at this time that would actually somehow help to stabilize matters?
Thank you. This is a very good question. I believe Israel must be enjoying all the upheaval in the Arab world. Nobody's talking about the Palestinian issue anymore, unfortunately. I'm going to ask John, actually, to answer this. You have just arrived 48 hours ago from Tel Aviv.
The Israelis, in general, are looking at what happens. I mean, I think the Israelis are being actually quite sensible of what happens in Syria. I mean, they're clearly not intervening. I'm not sure whether they're tempted to intervene. I doubt it very much. They clearly have some sort of operational coordination with the Russians over events down in the south. They are saying that they are taking and have been taking for several years humanitarian cases from the south for medical treatment in Israel. Personally, I suspect there's more to this than meets the eye. And this was the point of my question to Nazar Judah this morning, which he sidestepped. Because for Israel, the strategic, the critical strategic area is the south. This is Jebel Druze, it's the Hauran, it's the Golan. And the thing that Israel, I assume, does not want to see happen is Iran and Hezbollah on the Syrian Golan. That they will stop. I mean, and I think they've made those red lines absolutely clear.
And they are bombarding arms that are.
They are hitting, and I think they clearly have some sort of understanding with the Russians that if arms supplies, if they've diverted Russian arms going to Hezbollah, they will hit them. And I think that's inevitable. Of course, what happens in the longer term is up for grabs. The Israelis have a significant Druze population up in the Golan and parts of northern Galilee. So, and the interlinkage between them and the Druze communities in the south of Syria and Lebanon is intense. And the Druze themselves, the position of the Druze in this conflict is fascinating because they're neither with the opposition nor with the regime, really, down in the south. And they are terrified of what's going to happen if you get a significant jihadi presence down in the south. This is, for Israel, it's Lebanon, it's Hezbollah, it's Iran, but it's also jihadis they cannot control. On the Palestinian side, quite honestly, for me, if I'm an Israeli looking at this, what I'm seeing is the end of exceptionalism in the Middle East. This is, what happens in the Palestinian territories and the Palestinian position is the new normal. When Assad is barrel bombing civilians, when there are fences being built all over the Middle East, when there's ethnic cleansing happening all over the Middle East, what's the difference?
I hope you're wrong on this point, John. Okay, I think I want to take the question from the gentleman here, and then I'll come to you here.
Hi, Philip Blonde, Res Publica. Two questions. First, very simple. What, in your mind, would remove Daesh from the equation? I know we've skirted around it. I know it's very complex, but can you create something, broadly speaking, that could, in terms of political strategy allied to a military strategy, that could, in Syria, remove them from the equation? Second question, the history of Western intervention, recent Western intervention in North Africa is a history of missed opportunities. We missed opportunities in Libya, we missed opportunities in Syria. What would be different this time round? Are we in the West, together, NATO, EU, international institutions, in a different situation to genuinely take advantage of the opportunities that undoubtedly will present themselves?
Thank you. And who would like to answer these questions? Would you like, George? And I'll come back to you. Ambassador. Yeah.
The Islamic State is a remarkable event, and it's unique. It is an insurgency that has created a territory that has something resembling government, taxes, and so on, and a military that can take defeat. One of the characteristics of Arab militaries has been that when they get attacked and they lose, they don't recover. ISIS does. They not only do, but they counterattack somewhere else. In some way, this makes it easier for conventional military forces to take them on. In some ways, it makes it more difficult because the amount of force necessary is great. There's constantly declarations about how they're losing territory. It's hard to read whether they're deliberately shortening their lines to be more effective or actually being rolled back. Given the amount of force against them, I suspect it's deliberate withdrawal. But this is a case of a military force that is arrayed against them. And that military force is not going to be simply the United States with symbolic contributions from Europe. It has to be, if you wish, a NATO force. But that NATO force, I will now say what I want to say, there are 500 million Europeans, 200 million more than Americans. They have the same GDP. There is absolutely no reason within NATO that they cannot have the same size force as the United States. This is not 1950. One of the things that I can report, if you will, is that whereas Washington is somewhat oblivious to the issue, Donald Trump really struck a chord in the United States when he said that NATO doesn't work. And it's not that I like the guy, but in saying that, I mean, a lot of people nodded, yeah, this is a European problem, where are the European militaries? And this is going to become a structural issue in the United States in this election, and it's going to really pivot around the question of Islamic State. At some point, this is a problem that can be solved militarily, but it is not going to be solved with simply my son and daughter who are in the military taking the load. We're going to want to see Slovakians there too, a lot of them.
Yes, I think everybody wants to answer the question. Shall I go to you, Ambassador Verf?
Yeah, I agree with how George has characterized ISIL's or Daesh's unique quality, which makes it a formidable adversary. But it is fighting a conventional war, so kinetic action of a more decisive nature could at least remove it from the equation. But it's going to require a lot more effort than we're applying now, and it will require a ground force. Now, whether that has to be a European force, I think that's not going to happen. I think it more has to be regional players stepping up and taking their responsibility. Of course, in Iraq, it has to be the Iraqis themselves doing the bulk of it, and I think they're getting better. And the siege of Mosul may be coming later this year, and hopefully it will be successful, because that will make a big difference in terms of both the physical control of Daesh, but also the political sense of inevitability that it's on the it is the future, and that it can't be beaten. So if the question is, what's the ground force in Syria? I mean, it's right now a mixture. We've got the YPG, you've got some of the opposition, you've got some special forces from the US and other countries, but it doesn't add up to a coherent ground piece of this operation. Also important, of course, is cutting off their finances, their oil business. I mean, we have to have a
There is some
comprehensive
success
strategy.
there, I understand.
There's some success, but again, everything is kind of
Sure.
good, but not good enough.
Yes, yes, of course. Ambassador.
Well, the question is, what can remove Daesh from the equation? Daesh cannot be removed from the equation entirely. Entire eradication of Daesh does not seem to be realistic to me.
For the time being, I hope.
I mean,
Yeah.
I cannot
in
predict for
the near to
in
medium
the future.
Yes.
In Turkey, the surveys, public opinion surveys, indicate that something like 7 to 8% of the Turkish people are not disturbed, or I will not say that they are supporter of Daesh, but they are not disturbed of their presence. This corresponds to 3 or 4 million inhabitants in Turkey.
Sure.
So they are supporter of it at varying degrees. They are not militant, but they are sympathizers. So eradication of Daesh entirely is not something that is foreseeable for immediate future. But is it sustainable? No. The 21st century international community will not allow a quasi-state like Daesh to be there forever.
Yes.
So the two extremes are impossible, I mean, out of question.
Sure.
So something in between will take place according to the role that the international...
Very disturbing statistics, though, Ambassador, I must add. Yes. So.
The trouble is what you have is Islamic formulations that are all proto-state. So you could argue Boko Haram is going proto-state. They're going proto-state, arguably in Libya also. This is fundamental to the ideological pull and attractiveness of this Islamic movement. They need to be defeated on a territorial basis. The idea that they're permanent means we are accepting the permanence of this state of war. And then, as colleagues on the panel have said, this then produces a huge credibility gap for our security institutions like NATO that don't seem to be able to operate at scale. So what you're saying to me seems unsustainable.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think John wants to comment.
I want to say, I remember when I was ambassador in Iraq, 2009, 2011, Daesh's predecessor, Al-Qaeda, in Iraq, had actually been squeezed, very significantly. It hadn't gone away, but it was squeezed. It could launch some car bombings, it could do drive-by shootings, some sticky bombs and so forth. But it had been, and that was a combination of military pressure, but also political pressure. And of course, then, for reasons we all know, Daesh re-emerged. And Daesh emerged out of Iraq. It was in Iraq, and it emerged out of Sunni grievances. In the end, I think you can. There are kinetic options to deal with Daesh as a force and as a proto-state. But in the end, you're still left with these grievances. That, it seems to me, is a generational challenge, because if Daesh is destroyed militarily, son of Daesh will be along, Daesh 2.0 and so forth. I mean, this is a challenge for all the states of the region. And it's an ideational challenge above all.
Thank you, John. I think we have a question from the gentleman in the back, please, and then I'll come back to you.
Yes, my name is Ian Anthony from SIPRI in Stockholm. Given the makeup of the panel, I would like to come back to the question of the role of NATO, but rather than in generic terms across the region with a specific focus on Jordan. What are the enhanced opportunities for cooperation with Jordan? What are the mutual expectations as this relationship goes forward?
Thank you.
I guess that one's for me.
Yes, please.
Well, as I was saying very briefly at the beginning, I think the role of NATO going forward, if allies choose to use NATO as effectively as it could be used, is to significantly increase its assistance to countries like Jordan, who have been good partners, have been contributors to our operations, provide additional assistance in building up their armed forces, working on training, professionalization, providing specific kind of assistance to deal with the counter-terrorist threats, but to do this also on a broader scale across North Africa. We have very modest programs with Tunisia, which is looking for more support, Morocco, Libya may, now that a government may be forming, is likely to turn to NATO for capacity building assistance. we've done very well looking back to the 90s in Central and Eastern Europe and helping to westernize partner militaries. I think a lot of those same tools can be applied in the Middle East. So Jordan is perhaps our best partner in the Middle East now, but also a country with very limited resources. So if allies decide to channel more support and assistance through NATO, they could benefit greatly. So we call this in our trade projecting stability. It's sort of helping local forces become more capable to protect their own countries, to fight off extremist movements in their neighborhood. Based on the principle of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Thank you, Ambassador. Gentleman here, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrea Bogdanovsky, coming from Analytica think tank based in Skopje, Macedonia. Even though I'm sitting next to Russian gentlemen, I'm not Russian, but I will bring Russia back on the table. 2014, we have the agreement on destruction of chemical weapons arsenal. What we can learn from that diplomatic exercise, if something at all, and whether it was a hopeful effort by the Americans and by the Russians working together on this issue. Question number 2 is, what will you expect that there is, if there is going to be any change in terms of the new administration in Washington towards Syria? And the last one, I'll be super brief.
Yes, please, very brief.
Whether you have knowledge, for example, whether after the Russian military action in Syria, there have been new efforts for recruiting new soldiers to fight for the Free Syrian Army or the
Thank you. Thank you. Can I ask you to be as brief as possible? We're running.
Missed the last words of the last question.
Whether there are new efforts to recruit more and support more from the moderate rebel side or the Free Syrian Army, coming from support from the West. Thank you.
Well, I think the destruction of Assad's chemical weapons arsenal obviously was a good thing in terms of preventing further attacks on his own people with chemical weapons. But others may, question whether the decision not to follow through on the threats to use force at the time, in the end, had more costs than benefits down the road. But still, it's a good thing that he doesn't have all these chemical agents, and that at least that one form of suffering of the Syrian people has been shut off. I think it's a little inappropriate to get me to speculate on the results of the election. We'll have Senator Murphy tomorrow, I think.
Yes.
Can give you something more authoritative on that. But I think I agree with George Friedman's point that the whole debate that's going on about burden sharing prompted by Donald Trump is an issue that will be maybe more urgent no matter who wins the election. And but I also think that Europe is beginning to hear that message, and we're seeing increased defense spending in the majority of NATO countries and more efforts to contribute to the new deterrence measures that we're undertaking to deal with the Russian threat. Hopefully that'll also lead to more readiness to contribute in some way, whether it's directly through military force or through our partnership programs to help in the Middle East. I really can't answer the third question. I just don't know whether there's been
I think John
a
wants
direct
to
cause and
comment.
effect.
Just a quick point on the
Yes,
FSA point. I think if you look at the resilience of the FSA and other non-jihadi forces up in the north and south, it does suggest to me that they are getting supplies and support and funding from some sources, and quite relatively new. That's what I think.
I'd like to address
sorry, please.
Simply the election, American elections, if you take a look at the past 50 years, has been continuity, not discontinuity in foreign policy. I think an emerging consensus in the United States is that in general we're going to be much more selective in the insertion of ground forces. We are prepared to use air forces, particularly where there are no surface-to-air missiles. And this is the new model. I mean, this intersects the question of NATO, which is our willingness to engage in unilateral interventions. We have heard the Europeans, they've chastised us for doing it, we won't do it anymore. So now we won't have unilateral interventions, we will have multilateral interventions. We're ready to take suggestions. But this is a fundamental change in the American outlook, I think. I don't think a president has the option of dispatching multi-divisional forces to Syria, even if you wanted to.
Yes, can I take?
I will address only the second question, whether there are efforts to recruit more moderate opposition people. On two occasions, these efforts failed. One, the equip and train project funded by the United States. When these people were trained and equipped, they went there and
54
they delivered.
people, Ambassador, it was, remember? It was 54 people.
Yes.
Only 4 or 5 remained. So it's
Ye-
hardly a force.
Yes, I mean, it was an attempt, or at least an attempt to test, and it failed. A few weeks ago, I think it was yesterday, that another group sent by Turkey, I think, expelled the Daesh from somewhere, but Daesh came back again. This shows that more efforts has to be done, but also it indicates the discrepancies. Why discrepancy? Because the opposition is such a wide spectrum that among them there are Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a part of the Al-Qaeda, and more moderate and secular people also. So it depends where you choose your recruits from.
Yes, it's a difficult situation. I'm going to take one question from the iPad, which is written here. I don't see it anymore. And it's from my fellow Lebanese, Ayman Mhanna. And he is asking if Daesh defeated military design will appear until Sunni grievances are addressed. Oh, it was a tweet. Sorry. Oh, I'm really sorry. Well. Oh, okay. Forgive me, but at least I read it for you. So,
Can I say one of these tweets?
Let's go.
Can I just say one of these tweets that I said, it seems the jihadist forces in the north of Syria are getting supplies. I didn't. I said the non-jihadist forces.
Oh,
just
okay.
the way we tweeted it out.
Well, that's a chance for John to correct his. Can I please ask you, madam, to...
Neelam Dev, I'm from Gateway House in Mumbai.
Briefly as possible, please. We have about 5 minutes.
So in the Goldberg interview, President Obama expressed regret about the aftermath of Libya. And of course, there's been some amount of regret about Iraq as well, especially after the emergence of Daesh. Now that we are in the aftermath of Syria, how is that being looked at in terms of the fact of the numerous groups that are fighting in there? I mean, is there any sense that unilateral or just American interventions may longer be possible, but actually the effectiveness of interventions at all, and whether people shouldn't just stay away in both covert and overt ways?
Thank you. Can I ask? Yes, George?
Yeah, I think the United States has certainly changed its view on intervention. I think Obama was instrumental in that, but I don't think it would have just been Obama. But I mean, that really, and the world has to face this, costs something. Because what it really means is that the US action in Syria will be limited. It means that US actions elsewhere will be limited. And that means that other parties must pick it up. As I said, in the Middle East, there are 4 powers: Israel, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia.
If there is a Clinton administration, George, do you think that Clinton maybe is more inclined for interference than the Obama? Because I think she indicated more or less that she would be more willing. Do you see this happening?
I don't think there is any consensus whatsoever in the United States for... Remember, a large number of American troops were sent to Iraq. Many Americans, families were involved in that deployment. Nothing came of it. There's a sense that this is not a strategy that works and it should not be undertaken. So I don't think that the President of the United States, who's much weaker than most leaders, has the option of large-scale deployment, except in exceptional circumstances.
Sure. I think there was a question from the gentleman here, and then I'll go to the gentleman there. Yes, please. Yes. Can I please ask you to be as brief as possible? Yes, we need the microphone, please.
Yeah.
We need the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Martin Michelot from the European Institute for European Policy in Prague. We're talking about hard solutions, but I wanted us perhaps to try to look forward a bit and look at perhaps one of the items that started this crisis as well. And this is really, lack of opportunities, lack of jobs for the youth. And I wanted to know whether we as, smart people who are all in this room were able to think about what role the European Union could have in solving the aftermath of the crisis, whether we were able to rethink the system of development aid that lots of people have actually criticized as being ineffective, is not actually providing the conditions for a stable region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for calling us all smart people. We deserve that.
You're the only you.
Who would like to answer? Would you like?
Yeah.
He's in the EU.
Yeah,
Yes.
Ambassador, please.
Shall I?
Yes, yes.
European Union, of course, can play a role, but the diversity of opinion within the European Union, European Union is not a monolith. It's composed of 28 countries, 28 different views, and behind these different 28 different views, there are also opposition in the respective countries. So it is difficult, but it has to come to that stage. At present, we are dealing with more hot issues. First of all, stabilizing the situation. Without the country being stabilized militarily, I don't think that the soft power role could be conceivable or could be effective.
Thank you,
Just quick.
John.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's about development aid. I think it's about economic reconstruction. I think it's what George was talking about earlier. This is profound. I think one of the interesting things to watch in the region is what happens in Saudi Arabia. They clearly have an extremely ambitious plan for economic transformation over the next 10 to 20 years, which is something that everybody said should happen. So watching that is going to be really important. It's not everywhere that you have these problems. I think there are countries like the Emirates, for example. If you look at Azerbaijan, Marcelo, survey of Arab youth, a plurality of Arab youth want to live in the Emirates or want their country to be like the Emirates. I think, so I don't, it's about investment and it's about economic reconstruction rather than development assistance, I think. And that's a 20-year project.
Yes, Ambassador Vershpa.
I think the EU certainly has a role to play, particularly in terms of the wider region. I think, as distinct from post-conflict Syria, where we're not in post-conflict yet. I disagree with your previous questioner. We're a long way from that, and maybe closer to a post-conflict stabilization situation in Iraq. But thinking about the wider region, where Daesh is, making inroads but hasn't yet kind of made its breakthrough, this is where we should be concentrating efforts. I mentioned what NATO could do, which is just one slice of capacity building, development, helping countries develop the institutions and the policies that can give some hope to the disaffected rising generation and create stability and prosperity and all that. So there's certainly a role for the EU, but there's also a role for the countries of the region, working through the Arab League. The GCC should step up more and contribute with its vast resources. This has to be not just the West coming in and saving the Middle East. The Middle East has to save itself. In terms of post-conflict stabilization, I don't see any appetite either in NATO or in the US to go in on the ground. This will likely have to be a UN-led effort.
Sure.
But we can't just kind of pray and hope for the best as we did after the Libya operation. But at the same time, you have to, if you're going to start something, you have to be prepared to finish. I agree with George. You have to have a defined end state and then the sustaining power to finish the job. I think the Balkans were an example of a multilateral intervention that did succeed, at least in ending the killing and creating some political stability. It's still unfinished business, but at least they're not killing each other. Maybe that's the end state that one could set as your highest ambition in Syria, that they stop killing each other, and Daesh is at least cut so far down to size that they don't sort of become the virus that further melts down the region over and over again.
Thank you. Gentlemen, we have 2 minutes, and before we end, by a huge applause for our panelists, I want to pose a question for you that I hope you can answer very quickly. Where do you see Syria in 5 years? Ambassador, please.
The situation will go, the atrocities will go slightly down, but the problem will not be solved entirely.
I want to be more optimistic. I think after 5 years where things have gotten worse and worse, something's got to give, and I think at least limited action, carefully planned and defined, so it's not just intervention for the sake of doing something, has to happen, because the crisis is now not just about Syria, it's about the whole Arab world, and it's about Europe. So benign neglect or for trying to fence it off isn't going to work. So
Yes.
I'm optimistic that at least we can achieve some kind of durable ceasefire and cut Daesh influence way back. That would be maybe my most
A
optimistic.
federal Syria, George?
I don't think so. I think the real issue is how large ISIS grows. I mean, we are seeing it at a certain point here with substantial effort. We have not contracted it much. In the next 5 years, if there isn't concerted effort, I think ISIS is going to grow substantially and become effectively a nation state in the region. And the real question is, so yes, we can talk about Syria, we can talk about Iraq, we have this new entity there, and somehow we think it's going to go away, and I don't know why we think it's going to go away.
Yes, I agree. John?
A contained but continuing conflict.
Sorry?
A contained but continuing conflict.
Yes, that was really lovely and brief, wasn't it? Okay, I'm very happy to tell you that we will thank our panelists, but also there will be coffee and refreshments outside. And please do come back here at 12:15. We have the British Minister for Europe, Mr. Lidington, speaking to us. Thank you very much.